I was 16 with $63 and a rusted metal shell I bought for 15. They said I'd freeze. They said I'd starve. But I had my grandfather's journal, and buried in its pages was something more valuable than money, a map to survival. The door slammed behind me on a Friday evening in mid-September, the sound final as a judge's gavel. I stood on the sidewalk with my backpack pressed against my chest, the weight of everything I owned digging into my ribs. $63 in my pocket. That was all Rick had allowed me to keep from the summer I'd spent bagging groceries at Riverside Market. The sky over our neighborhood had gone the color of old dishwater, neither dramatic nor kind, just indifferent. Cars passed. A dog barked 3 houses down. Life continued its normal rhythm while mine splintered into something I didn't recognize. I waited 30 seconds, maybe a minute, thinking the door might open again, thinking my mother might call my name. The windows stayed dark. No curtain twitched. Inside that house were 12 years of my life after we'd moved here from Portland. My bed with the quilt. My grandmother made my desk, scarred with pencil marks from geometry homework. The cracked mirror in the hallway where I'd watched myself grow from child to something approaching adult. All of it sealed away now, belonging to a version of me that no longer had permission to exist. My fingers found the strap of my backpack and tightened until my knuckles went white. The pain felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Shock, I'd learn later, has a way of disconnecting you from your body. A mercy, maybe, or just your brain's last-ditch effort at protection. I started walking. Not because I knew where I was going, but because standing still made me smaller. The reason I'd been thrown out wasn't complicated. I'd gotten into a fight at school the day before, defending a freshman named Marcus from 3 seniors who'd cornered him behind the gym. One of them had a bloody nose by the time Coach Peterson pulled us apart. The school suspended me for 3 days. When I came home with the paperwork, Rick had been waiting in the kitchen, beer in hand. That look on his face I'd learned to recognize over the past 9 months. The look that said he'd been waiting for an excuse. Your daughter, he'd told my mother, not even bothering to use my name, is out of control. This is the last straw. She goes or I do. My mother had stood by the sink, hands in soapy water, and said nothing. Just stared at the dishes like they held answers she couldn't find anywhere else. That silence had cut deeper than anything Rick could have said. So here I was, 16 years old, $63, a backpack containing 2 pairs of jeans, 4 shirts, underwear, socks, a hoodie, my phone charger, a water bottle, and a photograph of my father that I'd grabbed from my nightstand. The photograph was from before the accident on Interstate 5 that took Daniel Bennett from us when I was 12. Before my mother, hollowed out by grief, had met Rick Callahan at some support group she'd stopped attending after the 3rd session. Before Rick had seemed kind and gentle during the courtship, only to reveal something harder and meaner once the wedding rings were on. I'd loved my father in the uncomplicated way children love their parents when life is still mostly safe. He'd worked construction, come home tired, but never too tired to ask about my day, taught me how to skip stones at Mirror Lake and how to check the oil in our old Subaru. Simple things, foundational things. When the semi-truck crossed the median and hit his pickup, it had felt like the ground itself had given way beneath our family. My mother had tried. I believed that then, and I believe it now. She'd tried to hold us together, tried to keep working her job at the medical billing office, tried to be both parents at once. But grief is exhausting, and loneliness makes people vulnerable to the wrong solutions. Rick had seemed like stability, a steady paycheck, a man willing to take on a widow and her daughter. The first 6 months after the wedding hadn't been terrible. Rick maintained the facade of decency. But cracks appeared. The way he'd comment on how much food I ate, how he'd changed the Wi-Fi password and made me ask permission to use it, how he'd started talking about my father in the past tense with a tone that suggested Daniel had been foolish, reckless, somehow deserving of what happened. When I'd pushed back, my mother had asked me to be patient, to understand that Rick was adjusting too, to remember that we were a family now and families made compromises. I'd compromised myself, nearly invisible, until yesterday when I'd chosen Marcus over my own safety, over the fragile peace I'd been trying to maintain. Some part of me had known even as I shoved that senior away from Marcus that this would be the end, that Rick would use it, that my mother would let him. Night came fast in late September. By the time I reached the older part of town near the shuttered lumber mill, the temperature had dropped and my breath made small clouds in front of my face. I found a spot behind the Greyhound station where the building blocked most of the wind and sat with my back against brick still warm from the day's sun. This was my first night without a roof that belonged to me. The concrete was cold through my jeans. Every sound felt amplified and threatening. A bottle rolling in the parking lot. Voices raised in the distance, the pneumatic hiss of a bus door closing. I pulled my hoodie tight and tried to make myself small in the shadows. Sleep came in fragments. 20 minutes dozing off, then jolting awake at the sound of footsteps. 30 minutes of exhausted unconsciousness, then shivering so hard my teeth chattered. By the time gray light started seeping into the sky, I felt hollowed out ancient, like I'd aged a decade in those few hours. Saturday morning, I walked to the Quick Mart 3 blocks away and bought 2 packets of instant noodles and a bottle of water. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with graying hair, barely glanced at me. I counted out exact change, $2.63, and left with my remaining $60 in change. Outside, I ate the noodles dry, straight from the package, the salt and starch turning to paste in my mouth. They tasted like cardboard and desperation, but my stomach had been growling since midnight. I tried calling my friend Jenna. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Tried another friend, Marcus, the one I'd defended, but his mother answered, and her voice went tight when I asked for him. "We think it's best if Marcus focuses on school right now," she said, which was code for, "We don't want our son involved with the violent girl who got suspended." By Saturday night, I'd found a different spot behind an old warehouse near the industrial area where Pine Ridge turned into something resembling countryside. Fewer people, fewer lights. Just rusted fences and buildings with broken windows, and the kind of quiet that felt like held breath. I spread my hoodie on the ground and lay down with my backpack as a pillow, staring up at stars I'd never noticed when I had a ceiling between me and the sky. The second night was worse than the first. Colder, longer. My body couldn't seem to regulate its temperature, shivering one moment, sweating the next, then shivering again. Hunger had moved past, growling into a hollow ache that made my head feel light and strange. I kept thinking about the refrigerator at home, the one that wasn't home anymore. All that food I'd taken for granted. Sunday I walked, no destination, just movement, because sitting still meant thinking, and thinking led nowhere good. My phone battery was at 15%, and I had no way to charge it, so I powered it down to save what little remained. The world without internet felt enormous and empty, like I'd been cut loose from the only tether that proved I existed. By Sunday night, I had $56 left. A loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter had cost $4. It would last me maybe a week if I was careful. The mathematics of survival were becoming clear and cruel. Every dollar spent brought me closer to nothing. And nothing meant decisions I didn't want to think about. I couldn't go to a shelter. The intake process would involve questions about my age, my guardians, why a 16-year-old was alone. They'd call Child Protective Services. I'd end up in foster care, maybe sent back to my mother and Rick, maybe placed somewhere worse. The system was supposed to help kids like me, but I'd heard enough stories from classmates who'd been through it to know that help was complicated at best and damaging at worst. So I stayed invisible, slept behind buildings, washed my face in public restrooms, tried to look purposeful when I walked, like I was heading somewhere that mattered so no one would look too closely and see the truth. Monday morning came with rain, cold and insistent, turning the world gray and slick. I huddled under an overhang near the old train depot, watching water sheet off the rusted metal roof, and felt something inside me crack. Not break entirely, but fracture. The kind of crack that says you can't keep going like this, that something has to change. That's when I thought of my grandfather. Silas Bennett had died 5 years ago, back when I was 11. Heart attack in his sleep, quick and clean the way he would have wanted. He'd been my father's father, a man who'd worked timber jobs and construction and anything else that paid, who'd taught me to bait a fishing hook, and who'd always smelled like sawdust and Old Spice. After he died, we'd buried him at Pine Hill Cemetery on the eastern edge of town under a Douglas fir that he'd said reminded him of the forests where he'd worked as a young man. I hadn't visited his grave since the funeral. The grief of losing my father had been too raw, too enormous to make room for missing my grandfather, too. But now, soaked and shivering and running out of options, I thought about him with sudden clarity. Silas had been a survivor. He'd grown up poor, worked his way through the Depression-era stories his generation told, built a life from almost nothing. If anyone's ghost could offer guidance, it would be his. The cemetery was a 40-minute walk from the depot. By the time I arrived, my jeans were soaked through and my sneakers squelched with every step. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the sky remained low and threatening. Pine Hill Cemetery sprawled across 3 acres of gentle hills, headstones in uneven rows dating back to the 1890s. I found my grandfather's grave near the eastern fence, the stone simple gray granite with his name dates and a single line he built with his hands and loved with his heart. I stood there dripping, looking at those words, and something in my chest loosened, then tightened, then loosened again. I crouched down, placed my hand flat against the wet grass, and whispered the first thing that came to mind. "I don't know what to do, Grandpa. I'm lost." That's when I saw it. The ground near the base of the headstone looked disturbed. Not fresh dirt, but not old either, sometime in the past few months maybe. A small section, maybe 18 inches square, where the grass grew thinner, the soil slightly mounded. My hands were digging before my brain caught up to what I was doing. The earth was soft from rain, giving way easily. 6 inches down, my fingers hit something hard. Metal. I scraped away mud until I could see the edges of a rectangular box, the kind used for important documents or keepsakes. Rusty hinges. A simple latch, no lock. I pulled it free and sat back on my heels, rain dripping off my nose, heart hammering. The box was maybe 10 inches by 14, 3 inches deep. Heavy. When I wiped mud from the lid, I could see scratches on the metal that might have been deliberate, might have been words worn smooth by time. The latch opened with a screech of corroded metal. Inside, wrapped in layers of plastic and cloth to protect against moisture, were 3 things: a leather journal, aged and cracked but intact, a hand-drawn map on heavy paper, the lines faded but still visible, and a pocket watch, silver tarnished but beautiful, with initials engraved on the back, S.B. My hands were shaking as I opened the journal. The first page, written in my grandfather's blocky handwriting, stopped my breath. To my Laurel Grace. If you're reading this, you need what I learned. The land provides for those who don't give up on it. I buried this here so you'd find it when you needed it most. Your daddy knew where it was, but I reckon if you're reading this, Daniel's gone and you're alone. I'm sorry for that, sweetheart. Sorrier than words can say. But you're a Bennett, and we don't quit. We adapt. Turn to page 47. Start there. All my love. Grandpa Silas. My vision blurred. Rain or tears or both. I flipped to page 47 with fingers that could barely grip the paper. The page held a detailed sketch of a curved metal structure, dimensions noted in precise handwriting. Beneath the drawing, an address, Old Pine Ridge Industrial Lot 7. And a note, built this in 87. Lived there 2 winters before your grandma forgave me. If you need shelter, it's yours. No one wants it. No one will stop you. Quonset hut, the label read. Government surplus, iron and stubbornness. I sat in the rain reading those words over and over until they burned into my brain. My grandfather had left me a map to survival, had buried it here 5 years ago, maybe knowing, maybe just hoping that someday I'd need it. The rest of that day vanished into a blur of motion. I wrapped the journal and map carefully in the plastic, tucked them into my backpack with the pocket watch, and started walking. The address meant nothing to me, but I'd find it. Old Pine Ridge Industrial, that was the area I'd been sleeping near. Lot 7 would be there somewhere. It took me 2 more days to locate it. Tuesday I spent walking the perimeter of the industrial area, noting street numbers, finding patterns. Wednesday morning I traced Old Pine Ridge Road to its eastern terminus and counted lots. Most were empty, some held rusting equipment, a few had collapsed buildings. Lot 7 sat at the far edge, backing up to a stretch of scrubland and second-growth forest. And there it was, a curved metal shell half buried in blackberry brambles and wild grass, maybe 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, the classic half-barrel shape I'd seen in old military photographs. Corrugated metal streaked with rust, one end open to the weather where a door should have been. I pushed through the brambles, thorns catching on my jeans and sleeves, until I stood in what must have been the entrance. The interior was dim and smelled of old water and earth. Debris everywhere, broken pallets, beer bottles, newspapers gone yellow, and brittle evidence of people who'd sheltered here and moved on. Spider webs hung thick in the corners. The curved ceiling showed rust holes in a few spots, though most of the metal looked intact under its patina of age. But it had a roof. It had walls. It was a space that could be made clean, made safe, made mine. I heard a voice behind me and spun around, heart lurching. An older woman stood at the entrance, silhouetted against the gray sky. She wore a faded flannel shirt tucked into work jeans, boots caked with mud, and her white hair was pulled back in a braid. Her face was lined and weathered in the way that spoke of years spent outdoors, and her eyes pale blue, sharp, took in the whole scene in one sweep. Me. The hut. The desperation I couldn't hide. "You're trespassing," she said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm, the tone of someone used to being heard. "I'm sorry I managed. I didn't think anyone... I was just looking. Looking for what shelter?" She studied me for a long moment. I tried to read her expression, but found nothing except careful neutrality. Then she asked, "What's your name?" "Laurel." "Laurel Bennett." Something shifted in her face. "Bennett, Silas's granddaughter." "Yes, ma'am." The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly. She stepped into the hut, looking around at the mess with the eye of someone who'd seen it before. "Silas was a good man. Stubborn as hell, but good. Built this place with his own hands back when I was..." She paused, calculating. 40-something. Long time ago. "You knew him? Knew him?" She looked at me directly now, and I saw something in her expression that might have been sympathy. Or recognition. "I'm Iris Whitmore. I own the land next door. Small farm, mostly just a big garden these days. Your grandfather and I were friends." The word friends carried weight I didn't understand yet. I just nodded, suddenly aware of how I must look, dirty, exhausted, obviously homeless, despite my attempts to hide it. "You in trouble?" Iris asked. I considered lying, considered all the ways I could frame my situation to sound less desperate, but something about her directness made dishonesty feel pointless. "I got kicked out. I'm looking for somewhere to stay." "How old are you?" 16. She nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Family situation. Stepdad didn't want me around anymore." Mom didn't argue. Iris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come have tea. We can talk about this somewhere that doesn't smell like dead animals and black mold." I hesitated. Every instinct I'd developed over the past few days screamed caution. Don't trust strangers. Don't let people know you're vulnerable. Keep moving. But I was tired. So tired. And this woman had known my grandfather, and something in her steady presence felt like the first solid ground I'd touched since Friday night. I followed her out of the hut and down a narrow path I hadn't noticed before. It wound through the blackberry brambles and opened onto a cleared acre of land with a small cabin at its center. The cabin was old, but well-maintained cedar shingles, silvered with age, a brick chimney releasing a thin stream of smoke. Around it, raised garden beds arranged in neat rows, most of them harvested down to stems and roots for the season. A golden retriever emerged from the porch as we approached, moving stiffly but with tail wagging. The dog was old muzzle gone, white eyes clouded with cataracts, but its ears perked when Iris spoke. "Easy Ash. She's a friend." The dog Ash sniffed my hand thoroughly before deciding I was acceptable. I scratched behind his ears and felt something in my chest ease. I hadn't touched another living thing with kindness since Marcus, and the simple warmth of the dog's fur under my palm nearly undid me. Inside the cabin was exactly what I'd imagined from the exterior. One main room serving as kitchen and living space, a wood stove radiating heat, walls lined with bookshelves and photographs in mismatched frames. A doorway led to what I assumed was a bedroom. Everything was clean, organized, lived in without being cluttered. It smelled like wood smoke and tea and something baking. Iris gestured to a small table by the window. "Sit. I'll make tea." I sat. Ash settled at my feet with a contented groan. Through the window I could see the garden beds, and beyond them, barely visible through the trees, the curved metal roof of the Quonset hut. Iris moved with practiced efficiency, filling a kettle and setting it on the wood stove, pulling down mugs and a tin of loose tea. She didn't ask me questions, just let the silence stretch comfortable and undemanding. When the tea was ready, something herbal that smelled of mint and chamomile, she sat across from me and wrapped her hands around her mug. The steam rose between us. "How long have you been on the street?" she asked. "Since Friday." 4 days. 4 days. She sipped her tea. "And you found the hut?" How I pulled out the journal, unwrapped it carefully, and showed her the first page. Iris read my grandfather's words with an expression I couldn't decipher. Then she smiled just slightly, as if remembering something private. He always was a planner, liked to think ahead. She turned to page 47, looked at the sketch and notes. "This drawing is better than what he worked from originally. He must have refined it. You were there when he built it." She nodded. "Late summer of 1987. He showed up one day with a trailer full of surplus metal and a wild idea about proving he could live independently. Your grandmother Ruth, lovely woman, had thrown him out temporarily. They'd had some argument about money or pride or both. Silas was too stubborn to apologize and too stubborn to fail, so he built that hut and lived in it for 2 winters. What happened? She took him back, eventually, but not before he nearly froze to death the first winter." Her voice carried a mix of fondness and exasperation. "He didn't know anything about insulation or heat retention, just figured the metal would be enough. It wasn't." Iris stood and walked to a shelf, pulling down a photograph in a simple wooden frame. She handed it to me. The image showed a younger version of her, maybe early 50s, standing next to my grandfather. They were both grinning, holding coffee mugs, with the Quonset hut visible in the background, looking newer, less overgrown. "November 1987, Iris said. "I'd just brought him soup and blankets for the 3rd night in a row. He finally admitted he might need help." I stared at the photograph. My grandfather looked happy, alive, more real than the fading memories I carried. "He talked about you sometimes," Iris continued, "after he moved back in with Ruth. Said you were smart, stubborn like him, that you'd do something important someday." She paused. "I'm guessing he didn't know it would be this." "I don't know what this is yet. Survival. That's always the first step." The tea warmed me from the inside out, or maybe it was just the cabin, the stove, the presence of another human being treating me like I mattered. I felt the exhaustion of 4 days catching up all at once, the adrenaline that had kept me moving finally draining away. "The hut is on county land," Iris said. "Technically abandoned property. There's been talk of developing this area for years, but it never happens. Budget issues, zoning disputes, bureaucracy." She looked at me directly. "If someone wanted to claim that hut, restore it, make use of it, I don't think anyone would stop them. How would someone claim it? There's an auction coming up. End of this month. County sells off abandoned structures for salvage, usually just contractors looking for scrap metal. If you could register and bid, you might get it for almost nothing. I don't have much money." "How much do you have?" I hesitated, then told the truth. $52. Iris smiled. "That might be enough." The next week passed in a strange limbo. Iris let me sleep on her couch after I promised I wouldn't run off without telling her. She fed me actual meals, soup, bread, eggs from her chickens, and didn't ask invasive questions about my plans. Ash seemed to accept me as part of the household, following me around the cabin and garden with his patient, arthritic devotion. During the days I cleaned out the Quonset hut, hauled debris, swept dirt, knocked down spider webs until my arms ached. The physical work felt good, purposeful. Each piece of trash I removed was one step closer to something that might resemble shelter. Iris helped when I asked, but mostly let me work alone, respecting that I needed to do this myself. Sometimes she'd bring lunch and we'd sit on overturned buckets eating sandwiches, and she'd tell me stories about my grandfather, how he'd helped her fix her roof after Raymond, her husband, had died 8 years ago, how he'd brought vegetables from his garden every summer, how they'd argued about politics and woodworking techniques and whether blackberry jam needed that much sugar. She saved my life that first winter, Iris said one afternoon, in the hut. I thought I was being noble, proving a point. Really, I was being a fool. Your grandmother was right about that. But Iris showed up with soup and blankets and common sense, and she didn't make me feel stupid for needing help. I looked up from the section of floor I was scrubbing. Why did you help him? Because people shouldn't freeze to death over pride. She said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And because I was lonely. Raymond had just died. The house felt too big and too quiet. Taking care of someone else gave me a reason to get up in the morning. I understood that. The need to be needed. The way purpose could pull you forward when nothing else would. The auction was Saturday, September 30th. Iris drove us in her old pickup truck, Ash riding between us with his head on my lap. The county auction yard was a gravel lot surrounded by chain-link fence filled with old farming equipment, stacks of salvaged lumber, and various structures deemed no longer useful to anyone. A bored-looking clerk sat at a folding table with a clipboard and cash box. Maybe 20 people milled around, mostly men in work clothes who looked like contractors. I felt out of place and obvious, a teenage girl in a borrowed jacket, but Iris walked me up to the table with such confidence that the clerk barely looked twice. Registering to bid, he asked, "Yes, sir," Iris answered before I could. "Lot 7, the Quonset hut." The clerk flipped through his papers. "That one's been sitting for years. Minimum bid's $10. If you want it, you'll probably get it." My heart hammered against my ribs. $10. I had 52. I could do this. The auction started at 9 and moved through lots with mechanical efficiency. Old tractors went for scrap metal prices. Lumber sold by the board foot. When they got to lot 7, only 2 people raised their hands, me and a contractor who looked bored. $10, the auctioneer called. I raised my hand. 15. The contractor raised his. My throat went dry. 20. I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. The contractor glanced at me, then at Iris, then back at the auctioneer. He shook his head. "Going once, twice, sold to the young lady for $20. The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down on the bumper of Iris's truck. I'd done it. For $20 less than a tank of gas, less than a week's worth of food, I'd bought myself a shelter. It was damaged and ancient and barely qualified as a building, but it was mine. Iris squeezed my shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud." I looked up at her, this woman who'd known my grandfather, who'd saved his life, who was now helping me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The tears came before I could stop them, hot and sudden, all the fear and exhaustion and desperate hope of the past week pouring out in messy, shuddering sobs. Iris didn't try to stop me, just kept her hand on my shoulder solid and warm while I cried. Ash pressed against my legs, offering the comfort only dogs can give, uncomplicated, unconditional. When I could finally speak, I managed to say, "I can't pay you back. For the food, the couch, everything. Not right away. Don't worry about that. But I should, Laurel." She waited until I looked at her. "Listen to me. You can't live in that hut alone. Winter's coming. You're 16. You don't know what you don't know yet." "I know I don't have a choice." "You do have a choice." She pulled back slightly, meeting my eyes with that steady, uncompromising gaze. "Here's what I'm offering you. Help me with my garden. The harvest work, the winter prep, the spring planting. In exchange, I'll help you make that hut livable. We'll do it together following your grandfather's notes. I'll teach you what you need to know, and you'll have a place to sleep while we work on it." "Why would you do that?" "Because your grandfather helped me when I needed it. Because I'm 71 years old and that garden's getting too big for me alone. Because—" She paused, and for the first time I saw something vulnerable in her expression. "Because I've been alone in that cabin for 8 years and I'm tired of it. Raymond would have wanted me to help someone, to not let loneliness turn me bitter." I thought about her offer. Thought about the alternative, trying to survive in an unfinished metal shell as temperatures dropped, scrambling for food and warmth and the knowledge I didn't possess. Thought about pride versus survival. "I don't want to be a burden," I said quietly. "Then don't be. Pull your weight. Show up. Work hard. That's all I'm asking." It wasn't charity she was offering. It was a trade. Respect for respect. Labor for knowledge. Two people who'd both lost something, finding a way to build something new from the wreckage. I wiped my face with my sleeve and nodded. "Deal." Iris smiled, and it transformed her whole face, made her look younger, lighter. "Good. Now let's go home and figure out where to start. Your grandfather's journal says page 47 is the beginning. Let's see what page 48 tells us." We drove back to her land with the auction paperwork folded in my pocket, proof of ownership thin as it was. The Quonset hut waited for us, rusted and empty and full of possibility. I'd been homeless for 9 days. I'd cried more than I had since my father died. I'd learned that survival wasn't about strength or fearlessness, but about accepting help when it was offered and choosing to keep moving even when the path ahead looked impossible. Somewhere in the years before he died, my grandfather had buried a journal next to his grave, banking on the possibility that his granddaughter might need it. That act of faith, that gesture of love across time and death, had led me here, to this moment, to this woman who'd saved him and was now offering to save me. I thought about the first page of the journal. The land provides for those who don't give up on it. I was starting to understand what that meant. Not that the land would give you everything easily, but that if you worked with it, learned from it, respected it, survival became possible. And maybe more than survival, maybe something like belonging. Part 2. Building and Learning. Page 48 of my grandfather's journal began with a single line sketched across the top foundation: "Is everything. Build wrong here, and winter will teach you the lesson twice." The morning after the auction, Iris and I stood inside the Quonset hut with the journal open between us. Late September sunlight filtered through the rust holes in the ceiling, making patterns on the dirt floor. The space looked worse in full daylight than it had during my first desperate inspection, 30 years of neglect, written in layers of grime and decay. Iris ran her hand along the curved metal wall, feeling for weak spots. "Your grandfather learned this the hard way. Metal conducts cold like it's trying to prove a point. You need 3 things before winter hits: drainage, so water doesn't pool and freeze underneath; insulation to keep the metal from turning this place into a refrigerator; and a way to seal it so wind doesn't whistle through like you're living in a cave." I turned to the next pages. My grandfather had documented his mistakes in careful detail: where water had pooled during his first November storm, which sections of metal had sweated condensation so badly the floor turned to mud, how wind had found every gap and made sleep impossible. Each failure was marked with a sketch showing the problem and a note explaining the solution. We started with drainage. Iris brought shovels from her cabin, and we spent 3 days digging a shallow trench around the perimeter of the hut, sloping it away from the structure so rainwater would flow downhill instead of collecting underneath the metal. My hands, soft from a childhood spent mostly indoors, developed blisters by the end of the first day. By the second day, the blisters had burst, and the raw skin beneath made every shovelful of dirt feel like punishment. Iris noticed me trying to hide my grimace. "Let me see." I showed her my palms, red and weeping. She disappeared into her cabin and returned with a tin of salve that smelled like mint and something medicinal. "Rub this in tonight and wrap them in clean cloth. You'll build calluses in a week. Until then, rest when you need to. Pride won't keep you warm." The phrase struck me as important somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. I would learn over the next months that survival required a constant negotiation between pushing yourself and knowing when pushing turned into breaking. By week 5, we'd finished the drainage and moved to clearing debris from inside the hut. Everything had to go: broken pallets, glass shards, newspapers that crumbled to dust when touched. We hauled it all to a pile behind Iris's property, where she periodically burned what could be burned and hauled the rest to the county dump in her truck. The work created a rhythm to my days. Wake at sunrise in Iris's cabin, eat oatmeal with honey from her hives, walk to the hut with tools and the journal labor until lunch, eat sandwiches sitting on overturned buckets, work until the light failed, return to the cabin for dinner and sleep. Simple. Exhausting, purposeful in a way that made the chaos of the previous weeks feel distant and unreal. During the second week of October, I turned to page 89 in the journal and found an entry dated November 15, 1987. The handwriting was shakier than usual, the ink blotted in places as if my grandfather's hands had been unsteady. Temperature hit 20 degrees last night. I was shaking so hard I couldn't sleep. Every breath felt like swallowing ice. At 2 in the morning, there was a knock on the metal door I'd hung yesterday. I nearly didn't answer. Thought maybe I was hallucinating from cold. But I dragged myself up, and there stood Iris Whitmore, with a thermos of soup and wool blankets stacked so high she could barely see over them. "You're too stubborn to ask for help," she told me, pushing past into the hut. "So I'm not asking. I'm just doing." She stayed until I'd eaten the soup, chicken, and rice still steaming, and watched me pile on the blankets. Then she looked around at my pathetic attempt at insulation and said, "Tomorrow we're fixing this properly. You'll freeze to death before Thanksgiving if you keep trying to prove whatever point you think you're proving." I wanted to argue, wanted to maintain my pride, but my teeth were chattering too hard to form words. She saved my life that night. I swear when I have the means I'll repay her. Not with money, she'd never take it, but with presence, with showing up, with being the neighbor she was to me. I looked up from the journal to find Iris watching me. "You saved his life." She shrugged, but something in her expression had gone soft. He was being an idiot. Someone had to intervene. The entry said you brought soup and blankets at 2 in the morning. Raymond, my husband, had died that March. Heart attack while mowing the lawn, sudden and complete. I wasn't sleeping well those months. Grief does strange things to your schedule. I'd been awake staring at the ceiling when I remembered your grandfather was out here trying to survive in a metal box with no insulation. Got up, made soup, grabbed every blanket we had. She paused. Saving him gave me something to do besides miss Raymond. Gave me a purpose. What happened after we insulated the hut together? Took us 2 weeks working every afternoon. He learned to accept help, and I learned that helping someone else can be its own kind of healing. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes had gone distant with memory. He repaid me for 40 years after that. Fixed my roof when it leaked. Split firewood every fall. Brought vegetables from his garden every summer. That's what neighbors do. That's what community means. The word community had never meant much to me before. In the suburbs where I'd grown up, neighbors were people you waved to while getting mail, not people who showed up at 2 in the morning with soup. But here on this forgotten edge of town where the industrial area bled into farmland community was apparently something different, something necessary. We spent the next 3 weeks following my grandfather's revised instructions for insulation. First came a layer of salvaged foam board Iris had acquired years ago for a project Raymond never completed. We cut it to size with a handsaw and fitted the pieces between the metal ribs of the Quonset structure, filling gaps with expanding foam from the hardware store. Then came a layer of heavy plastic sheeting to create a moisture barrier stapled carefully to prevent condensation from collecting on the metal. The work was tedious and precise. My hands learned the ache of repetitive motion, cutting, fitting, stapling, checking. But each section we completed made the interior of the hut feel more enclosed, more separate from the outside world. The transformation was incremental, but real. Money became a constant calculation. I'd started working at Riverside Market in early October, stocking shelves and running the register Thursday through Saturday. The owner, Dorothy Klein, was a woman in her late 50s with graying blonde hair and the kind of competence that came from running a business alone for 2 decades. Her husband had died young cancer, she mentioned once without elaboration, and she'd raised 2 sons while keeping the market profitable. She asked few questions when I applied, just looked at me with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail and said, "Can you show up on time and work without complaining?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you're hired. $10 an hour paid weekly in cash. Don't steal and don't be rude to customers." The $40 I made each week felt simultaneously like a fortune and nowhere near enough. After setting aside money for food and materials, I tried to save what remained, building a small emergency fund in an envelope hidden in my backpack. $10 one week, 15 the next. The pile grew with painful slowness, but it grew. Vernon Shaw ran a small mechanic shop on the eastern edge of town, the kind of place that fixed whatever you brought in: cars, tractors, lawnmowers, anything with an engine. Iris knew him from the farmer's market where she sold vegetables in summer, and she'd mentioned to him that I was handy with tools. He appeared at the hut one afternoon in late October, a man in his early 60s with oil-stained hands and a limp from some old injury. Looked around at our work and nodded approvingly. "Iris says you're good at following instructions and not afraid to get dirty." "I guess so. I could use someone to help sweep up organized parts, maybe learn some basic repair work. $15 an hour, 3 afternoons a week." Interested. The math clicked instantly in my head. 3 afternoons at 4 hours each, 12 hours total, $180 a week. Combined with the market job, I'd be making over $200 weekly. Enough to buy materials, enough to save, enough to prove I could sustain this. "When do I start Monday?" Vernon turned out to be a patient teacher, the kind who showed you something once slowly, then let you try while he watched without hovering. He taught me how to change oil without making a mess, how to check brake pads for wear, how to diagnose common engine problems by sound alone. The work was completely different from stocking shelves, but I discovered I liked it. The logic of mechanical systems, the satisfaction of fixing something broken, the way Vernon treated me like someone capable of learning instead of a charity case. By mid-November, we'd installed a door on the Quonset hut, a solid wooden frame salvaged from a demolished house hung on hinges Vernon had lying around his shop. It didn't fit perfectly, and the gaps required weather stripping and careful shimming, but once it was in place, the interior temperature jumped several degrees just from blocking the wind. The water collection system came next. Page 112 of the journal detailed my grandfather's design: gutters made from halved PVC pipe attached to the lower edge of the curved roof, funneling rainwater into food-grade plastic barrels. Iris contributed 3 55-gallon drums she'd used for rainwater collection before her well was drilled, and we spent a weekend positioning them and connecting the makeshift gutters. The first rain after installation felt like a small miracle. I stood inside the hut listening to water plink and rush through the PVC, watching the barrels slowly fill with clean, clear rainwater, 165 gallons of storage, enough for drinking, cooking, washing, enough to make me less dependent on carrying jugs from Iris's cabin. Iris appeared in the doorway, her hair damp from the drizzle. "How's it working?" "Perfectly." I couldn't keep the pride from my voice. "Your grandfather would be pleased." She stepped inside and looked around at the transformation. "You've done more in 6 weeks than most people would accomplish in 6 months. We've done it." "No," she was firm about this. "I've helped. You've done the work. Don't diminish that." The correction felt important. I'd spent so much of my life being told I was a burden, a problem, someone who required management. Iris's insistence that I take credit for my own labor was a kind of permission I hadn't known I needed: permission to be competent, capable enough. Week 11 brought the discovery that would change everything. Iris asked me to help clean out her storage shed, a task she'd been avoiding for months. We pulled out rusted garden tools, bags of potting soil gone hard as concrete, stacks of clay pots in various states of breakage. In the back corner, covered with a tarp and surrounded by mouse droppings, we found a cardboard box. Iris went very still when she saw it. Inside the box, packed with protective foam and still sealed in its original plastic, was a solar panel. The label read, 100 watts polycrystalline, suitable for off-grid applications. I didn't know you had this. Iris touched the plastic wrapping gently, like it might dissolve under her fingers. Raymond bought it 3 years before he died. He'd been reading about solar power, getting excited about the idea of being less dependent on the grid. Kept saying we should install it on the cabin roof, use it to run lights and maybe a fan. She paused, and I heard the weight of loss in the silence. He died before we got around to it. I couldn't bring myself to look at it after that, so I packed it away. You kept it all this time. Couldn't throw it away. Felt like throwing away his dreams. She looked at me and something shifted in her expression. But keeping it in a shed isn't honoring anything. Take it. Use it for the hut. I can't take something your husband bought. Laurel. Her voice was gentle but unyielding. Raymond wanted us to be prepared, to be independent, to not be at the mercy of systems we couldn't control. You building that hut, making yourself independent, that's exactly what he believed in. She lifted the box and placed it in my hands. Let me help you. It's what he would have wanted. The solar panel was heavier than I expected, both physically and emotionally. I thought about Raymond, a man I'd never met, buying this equipment with hope for the future, dying before he could use it, and now his widow passing it to me like a baton in a race neither of them had expected to run. Thank you doesn't feel like enough? Iris smiled, and it was sad and warm at the same time. Then don't say it. Just be here. Just keep building. Installing the panel required 2 days of research, trial, and careful adjustment. Iris found a battery and inverter that Raymond had also purchased, still in their boxes. I downloaded instruction manuals on the library's Wi-Fi and studied them until the technical language started making sense. Vernon looked over the setup and helped me understand the wiring, explaining voltage and amperage in terms that translated to practical application. We mounted the panel on a wooden frame positioned south of the hut where it would catch maximum sunlight. Ran heavy gauge wire through a small hole we drilled in the metal wall. Connected everything to the battery and inverter following the manufacturer's diagrams with the kind of focus usually reserved for diffusing bombs. The moment I flipped the switch and the LED light fixture salvaged from Vernon's scrap pile blazed to life, I felt something crack open in my chest. Not break. Open. Like a seed splitting to let the first green shoot emerge. Iris had been standing in the doorway watching. When the light came on, her hand went to her mouth and her eyes filled with tears. I turned off the light and crossed to her, suddenly understanding that this wasn't just about electricity. It was about Raymond's dream finally being realized, about his purchases, finding purpose, about death not having the final word on what people build. We stood there in the doorway, this woman who'd saved my grandfather and was now saving me, and me, a girl who'd been homeless less than 2 months ago, and we cried together. Different grief, same need for light. December arrived with frost on the ground and breath visible in the morning air. Officer Dylan Martinez had been patrolling the industrial area more frequently, and it was only a matter of time before our paths crossed again. It happened on a Thursday afternoon while I was hauling scrap metal to Vernon's truck. The patrol car pulled up alongside the hut, and Martinez climbed out, his uniform crisp despite the cold. He was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe late 20s, with the careful alertness of someone still learning how to balance authority with compassion. Laurel Bennett. Yes, sir. He gestured at the hut. You've been working on this place. I own it. Bought it at county auction. I kept my voice steady, factual. Mm-hmm. He pulled out a small notebook. And where are you living? The question was a trap, and we both knew it. If I said the hut, he'd report an unaccompanied minor living in substandard housing. If I didn't answer, he'd assume the worst. Before I could formulate a response, Iris's truck pulled up and she stepped out with the kind of calm authority that comes from 7 decades of not being intimidated by much. "She's with me, officer. Temporary arrangement while we work out the paperwork." Martinez turned his attention to her. "Mrs. Whitmore. And what paperwork would that be, guardianship?" "I'm in the process of filing for temporary custody. Her mother's situation isn't stable and I've known the family for years. She stays at my place, helps with my property, and we're fixing up that hut as a project, all legal and above board." She was lying smoothly, authoritatively, and I tried to keep my expression neutral while my heart hammered. Martinez looked between us, calculating. "I'll need to see documentation within 2 weeks. If this is a legitimate guardianship arrangement, there should be paperwork filed with the county. I'll have it to you." He nodded slowly. "Make sure you do. Because if I find out a minor is living unsupervised in inadequate housing, I'll have to involve Child Protective Services. That clear crystal." After he drove away, Iris turned to me. "We need to actually file the paperwork now. I'd been hoping to avoid the bureaucracy, but Martinez is right. If you're going to stay here, it needs to be legal." "Will they approve it?" "Only one way to find out." The county office smelled like recycled air and desperation. We sat in plastic chairs, waiting for our number to be called, surrounded by people navigating their own crises. Custody disputes, housing assistance applications, proof of identity for those who'd lost everything. I was just one more lost kid in a system designed to process lost kids efficiently. When our turn came, Iris presented our case to a tired-looking caseworker named Patricia Donnelly. She listened with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd heard every variation of family disaster and no longer found any of them surprising. "How long have you known the minor?" "I knew her grandfather for 40 years. I've known Laurel since she was small, though we lost touch after her father died. When I learned her current home situation had become untenable, I offered to help." Patricia looked at me. "Why can't you stay with your mother?" I chose my words carefully. "My stepfather and I don't get along. My mother chose to prioritize her marriage over my safety." Patricia made notes on her form. "And you're currently staying with Mrs. Whitmore, helping with her property in exchange for room and board while we work on making the Quonset hut habitable. You're 16. You should be in school. I plan to pursue my GED. I can study while working and still meet the educational requirements." More notes. More questions about income, housing, stability, my health, my plans. The interview lasted an hour. At the end, Patricia leaned back in her chair and studied us both. "This is irregular. Guardianship usually involves relatives or licensed foster parents." Iris met her gaze without flinching. "Usually, but not always. Sometimes the system makes room for common sense." Patricia almost smiled. "I'm going to approve temporary guardianship for 6 months. That gives you both time to prove this arrangement works. But there are conditions. Laurel needs to be enrolled in an educational program, she needs regular medical checkups, and I'll be doing home visits to ensure the living situation is appropriate. Any problems, and we revisit this immediately." "Understood. Understood." We left with paperwork that made Iris my legal guardian until June. It felt surreal. This woman I'd known for less than 3 months now had authority over my education, my health care, my basic welfare. But it also felt right in a way I couldn't fully explain. Sometimes family isn't who you're born to, sometimes it's who shows up. The community that formed around us over the next months was small but real. Dorothy at Riverside Market started forgetting loaves of bread that were a day old, leaving them in a bag by the back door where I'd find them at the end of my shift. She never mentioned it, and I never thanked her, but the bread appeared every Saturday without fail. Vernon taught me advanced mechanical skills on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, while country music played on his radio and the space heater in his shop fought against the December cold. He paid me in cash every Friday. Always exact change, always with a nod that acknowledged work completed rather than charity extended. Pastor Elwood from First Baptist Church appeared one afternoon with his wife Constance, both of them carrying boxes of winter clothing. His church had a donation program, he explained, and they'd noticed I might benefit. The coats were good quality, barely worn. The boots fit. I tried to refuse on principle, but Iris gave me a look that said pride was a luxury I couldn't afford. So I accepted with as much grace as I could muster. Slowly, invisibly, I was being held. Not controlled or managed, but supported. These people, most of them strangers a few months ago, were choosing to show up, choosing to help. And I was learning that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. By mid-January, the Quonset hut maintained an interior temperature 10 degrees warmer than outside without any additional heating. The insulation worked. The doors sealed. The water barrels stayed liquid even when ice formed on Iris's pond. I'd created something that could withstand winter, and the knowledge filled me with a quiet pride that felt more substantial than any grade I'd ever received in school. Iris and I fell into a routine of eating dinner together 3 nights a week. She'd cook something simple: stew, roasted chicken, pasta with vegetables from her freezer, and we'd sit at her table while Ash dozed by the wood stove and the world outside turned dark and cold. On one of those nights in late January, Iris pulled out a wooden box I'd never seen before. It was cedar polished smooth with age and handling about the size of a shoebox. She set it on the table between us with hands that trembled slightly. "There's something I want to show you." Inside the box were letters, dozens of them organized chronologically in bundles tied with string. The top bundle was labeled in neat handwriting, Raymond's last year. Iris lifted the bundle like it weighed far more than paper should. He knew he was dying. The doctor told him his heart was failing, that it could be a year or 5 years or tomorrow. So he started writing me letters, one for every week after he was gone, sealed and dated. She untied the string and pulled out the most recent one, opened the paper creased from repeated reading. "This is from last month. 8 years of letters, and I'm only this far through them." She handed it to me. "Read it, please." The letter was written in handwriting that matched the dates on the seed packets Iris used for her garden. Raymond's hand still present in these small artifacts. The paper was yellowed slightly, the ink blue. "My dearest Iris, if you're reading this, I've been gone long enough that you might be settling into the shape of life without me. I hope it fits better than it did in the beginning. I hope you're finding reasons to laugh, to get out of bed, to keep the garden growing. I'm writing this on a Tuesday afternoon in March, watching you through the kitchen window while you transplant tomato seedlings. Your hands move with such confidence, such knowledge. You've always known how to make things grow. Plants, our marriage, the community around us. It's your gift. When I'm gone, don't be alone. I know you'll want to. I know your first instinct will be to close the door and tend your grief like it's the only thing left worth cultivating. But grief is not a garden. It doesn't bloom. It just spreads until there's no room for anything else. Find someone who needs what you have to give. Love doesn't run out. It multiplies. Every kindness you extend to someone else is a kindness extended to me, to us, to everything we built together. Take care of the garden, and take care of someone who needs a garden too. All my love, always. Raymond. The paper blurred in my hands. I tried to speak, but my throat had closed around words that wouldn't come. Iris was crying silently across from me, tears tracking down her weathered face. "I think he sent you to me." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Or maybe your grandfather did. Or maybe it's just that the universe sometimes gets it right. But you showing up when you did, needing what you needed, it gave me a reason to get up, to do something besides read letters and miss him." I reached across the table and took her hand. Her grip was strong despite the arthritis, warm despite the cold outside. "You're my family now." She squeezed my fingers. "You're mine too." We sat like that while the wood stove ticked and Ash snored and the January wind rattled the windows. Two people who'd been alone finding a way to be alone together, which was really just another way of saying family. The lessons Iris taught me over those winter months extended far beyond construction and survival. She showed me how to cook without recipes, adjusting ingredients by taste and texture until the result satisfied, how to sew a straight seam and mend torn fabric so the repair became nearly invisible, how to identify which vegetables in the freezer would keep longest and which needed to be used first. In late February, she pulled out a basket of yarn and crochet hooks. My grandmother taught me this when I was 7. Her grandmother taught her. It's a line of knowledge passed down through generations of women who needed something to do with their hands while they thought. She showed me how to hold the hook, how to tension the yarn, how to make the basic chain stitch that formed the foundation of everything else. My first attempts were clumsy, the stitches too tight or too loose, but Iris corrected me with patience that never felt like judgment. Every generation passes something down. Her hands moved steadily, creating a neat row of double crochet. "I'm passing this to you." The phrase settled into me like a stone dropped in still water ripples spreading outward. I thought about my grandfather's journal, about Raymond's letters, about this continuous chain of people trying to give the next generation tools for survival and meaning. Legacy wasn't about money or property. It was about knowledge, about showing up, about making sure someone else didn't have to learn everything the hard way. By the time March arrived, I'd made a scarf long enough to wrap around my neck twice. It was lumpy and irregular, but it was warm, and it was mine. Iris pronounced it excellent for a first attempt, which I knew was generous, but appreciated anyway. The garden preparation started in early March. Iris walked me through her beds, explaining which had grown what the previous season and why rotation mattered. Tomatoes couldn't follow tomatoes, or they'd deplete the soil of specific nutrients. Beans put nitrogen back that corn and squash removed. It was a conversation between plants and earth that required years to understand fully, but I was beginning to learn the vocabulary. We turned the soil with pitchforks, breaking up the winter's compression, mixing in compost Iris had been building for decades. The work was hard on backs and shoulders, but it felt productive in a way that made the ache worthwhile. Ash followed us around the garden, occasionally digging his own holes and looking pleased with himself until Iris redirected him away from the seedlings. Sometimes while we worked, Iris would tell stories about Raymond, how they'd met at a county fair in 1971, how he'd courted her with wildflowers because he couldn't afford roses, how they'd decided against children after years of trying, choosing instead to pour that love into their land, their community, each other, how his death had felt like losing gravity itself, suddenly floating in a world that no longer made sense. I told her about my father in return, about his patience when teaching me to fish, about the way he'd sing off-key while making pancakes on Sunday mornings, about the phone call that came while I was at school, my mother's voice on the other end, already broken, already changed into something I didn't recognize. We traded grief like currency. Each story an acknowledgement that loss was real, but didn't have to be the end of everything. That people could die and still be present in the routines they'd established, the knowledge they'd passed down, the way they'd taught us to be kind. One evening in late March, Iris showed me a photograph I hadn't seen before. It showed her and Raymond standing in front of a newly built greenhouse, both younger but already settled into each other in that way long married couples develop. They were holding hands, smiling. 52 years we had. She traced the edge of the frame with one finger. Not enough. Never enough. But I'm grateful for every one of them. Do you think you'll ever not miss him? No. She said it simply, without drama. The missing becomes part of you, like breathing. You don't stop doing it, you just learn to do it without breaking down every time. She looked at me. That's what survival is. Not forgetting, not moving on, just learning to carry it without letting it crush you. I thought about my father, about the way his absence had shaped my adolescence, the way I still sometimes reached for my phone to call him before remembering. The grief hadn't disappeared. I'd just gotten stronger at carrying it. That's what this whole project is teaching you. Iris gestured toward the hut visible through her kitchen window. How to carry weight. How to build something that lasts. How to survive not by being invulnerable, but by being adaptable. The words settled into me alongside all the other lessons she'd been teaching. Survival wasn't about armor, it was about flexibility, about learning when to accept help and when to stand alone, about building systems that could weather storms and maintaining relationships that could weather grief. By the end of March, I'd been living this strange new life for 6 months, working 2 jobs, building a shelter, learning to garden and cook and crochet, studying for my GED in the evenings with books borrowed from the library. It bore no resemblance to what I'd imagined my junior year of high school would look like, but it felt more real than anything I'd experienced before getting kicked out. The Quonset hut was nearly habitable, not comfortable yet not finished, but livable. The temperature stayed steady, the lights worked, the water collection functioned. I could theoretically move in tomorrow if I needed to. But Iris's couch had become familiar. Our dinner routines felt essential. Ash had started sleeping at the foot of my makeshift bed, his warmth and presence a comfort I hadn't known I needed. Moving out felt both like the logical next step and like abandoning something I'd just started building. We never discussed it explicitly, but gradually my belongings that had been packed away in my backpack began spreading through Iris's cabin. A book on her coffee table, my work boots by the door, my jacket hung on the hook beside hers. Small markers of belonging that neither of us commented on but both of us noticed. Then came the moment that would test everything we'd built. It arrived on a Tuesday evening in the last week of March when Iris sat me down with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "There's something you should know." Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted in her lap. "I went to the doctor last week for the checkup I'd been putting off. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thin. They found something. A mass. Pancreatic." She met my eyes. "It's operable, they think. But it's serious, Laurel. Surgery in 2 weeks, then recovery, then we'll know more." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. I'd just found her. Just found this life, this family, this person who'd saved me. The universe couldn't be cruel enough to take her now. "How long have you known?" "Since Thursday. I wanted to process it myself first. Figure out what it meant." She reached across and took my hand. "I'm telling you because you're family, because you deserve to know, and because I need you to understand that whatever happens, you'll be okay. You've built something here. You've proven you can survive. I don't want to just survive." My voice cracked. "I want you." The surgery happened on a cold morning in mid-April. Vernon drove us to the hospital in Portland, Iris in the passenger seat trying to appear calm, while I sat in the back gripping Ash's collar like an anchor. The surgery would take 4 hours, they said, maybe 6. They wouldn't know what they were dealing with until they opened her up. Vernon and I sat in the waiting room with Ash at our feet. The hospital had made an exception given the circumstances. The hours crawled. Vernon brought coffee I couldn't drink, made small talk I couldn't focus on, just sat beside me in that particular kind of companionable silence men like him excel at. When the surgeon finally emerged, her face was carefully neutral. The surgery went well. We got clear margins. She'll need chemotherapy, but the prognosis is good. She's strong for 71. The relief made my legs weak. Vernon caught my elbow, steadied me, said nothing. Iris spent 4 days in the hospital. I visited every afternoon after my shift at the market, bringing updates about the garden, about customers who'd asked after her, about Ash, who'd been moping by her empty chair. She was pale and diminished in the hospital bed tubes and monitors, making her seem more fragile than I'd ever seen her. But her grip was still strong when I held her hand. The recovery was slow. 6 weeks before she could do light work. 3 months before she'd be fully herself again. The chemotherapy would start in May and last through summer every 3rd week, making her sick and tired in cycles we'd have to learn to navigate. I moved back to Iris's cabin fully during those weeks. Not because she asked, but because it was obvious. She needed help and I would provide it. The hut could wait. This couldn't. I learned to cook her favorite foods even when she had no appetite. Learned to help her to the bathroom without making her feel diminished. Learned to sit with her during the bad days and celebrate the good ones. Learned that caring for someone you love is both harder and more important than any physical structure you could ever build. The garden still needed tending. I did it alone now, following the pattern she'd taught me, making decisions based on knowledge she'd passed down. The tomatoes I planted that spring were a prayer disguised as agriculture. Please let her live to harvest them. Vernon took over some of my shifts so I could be home more. Dorothy sent soup 3 times a week. Pastor Elwood visited regularly, sitting with Iris and talking about nothing and everything while I worked in the garden. The community we'd been building was holding us now, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was the whole point. Not independence, but interdependence. Not self-sufficiency, but mutual support. By late May, Iris was moving around the cabin more, sitting in the garden for short periods, smiling more days than not. The chemo was brutal. She'd spend 3 days barely able to lift her head, but she endured it with the same steady determination she'd brought to everything else. One evening in early June, she gestured me over to where she sat by the window. "I need to tell you something." My heart clenched. More bad news? No. Good news. She pulled out a folder of legal documents. "I've been working on this for a while, had the lawyer finalize it last week. I'm making you co-owner of this property. The cabin, the land, everything. Legal and binding. So if something happens to me, you're not left with nothing." Iris, let me finish. You've earned this, not just by helping me, but by building something real here, by proving you can turn wreckage into shelter. She pressed the folder into my hands. "This is your home. I want it recognized legally." The documents made it real. Laurel Grace Bennett, co-owner. Equal rights to the land, the cabin, the future. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep building, keep growing, keep passing things down. That's all I ask. I will. The promise felt enormous and simple at the same time. I promise. Tara, Part 3. Crisis and Belonging. The forecast came through on a Tuesday morning in early April the following year, crackling across Vernon's radio while I was organizing spark plugs. The meteorologist's voice carried that particular tension reserved for genuinely dangerous weather. Historic winter storm system moving down from Canada. National Weather Service has issued a blizzard warning for all of Western Oregon, expecting temperatures to drop to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. Snowfall accumulation of 20 to 30 inches. This will be the coldest, most severe storm in 3 decades. Residents are urged to prepare for extended power outages and impassable roads. Vernon looked up from the engine he was rebuilding, grease streaking his forearms. "You got that hut ready for this?" "I think so. Everything Grandpa's journal said to do, we did. Thinking and knowing are different animals." He wiped his hands on a rag. "Better double-check your supplies. Storm like this, you could be stuck for days." I spent that afternoon going through the Quonset hut with the journal open to pages 145 through 152, my grandfather's emergency preparedness checklist. Insulation complete, door seals tight, water storage 165 gallons in the barrels plus 10 gallons in jugs for backup. Food, 2 weeks' worth of rice beans, canned goods, peanut butter. Firewood stacked against the north wall, enough for 10 days of the small wood stove Vernon had helped me install last month. Solar battery fully charged with backup candles and matches sealed in waterproof containers. The hut was ready. The question was whether I was. Iris found me running through the checklist for the 3rd time. Her boots crunched on the frozen ground outside, ash beside her, moving more stiffly than usual in the cold. She'd finished her chemotherapy 3 months ago and was declared in remission, but the treatment had aged her in ways that made my chest ache. "Weather's going to be bad." "I know. You planning to ride it out here? I need to test it. Need to know if everything we built actually works." My hands wouldn't stop moving, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. "If it fails, better to know now than next winter when I might not have backup options." Iris studied me with that look she had, the one that saw past whatever I was saying to what I actually meant. "You're scared. Terrified. Good. Fear keeps you careful." She stepped fully inside, looking around at the space we'd transformed over 6 months. Then her expression shifted into something more resolute. "I'm coming with you." "What?" "No. It's too dangerous." "Exactly why I'm coming. We built this together. We test it together." Her voice left no room for argument. "Besides, Ash gets nervous in storms, and your place will be warmer than mine once the power goes out." The real reason hung unspoken between us. She didn't want me facing this alone, didn't want to sit in her cabin wondering if I was freezing or scared or hurt. And if I was honest, I didn't want to be alone either. "When does the storm hit tomorrow night? Then we've got time to bring over extra supplies." We spent Wednesday afternoon shuttling items between her cabin and the hut. More blankets, her cast iron soup pot, additional candles, Ash's bed and food, medical supplies from her bathroom cabinet. With each load, the hut felt less like a survival experiment and more like something approaching shelter for 2 people and a dog who'd somehow become my family. That evening, we ate dinner at her table one last time before the storm. Iris had made beef stew thick with potatoes and carrots from her root cellar, and we soaked bread in the broth while the wind outside began picking up, testing the cabin's defenses. "Your grandfather nearly died during a storm like this." She broke the silence carefully, the way you handle fragile things. 18 years ago. Late March. Same kind of freak cold snap. The hut wasn't insulated yet. This was before we'd fixed it properly. Temperature